Hey everyone, welcome to Grit Machine DNA, where we interview people of incredible grit to inspire you. Today I'm joined by Damon Patton, lawyer, bodybuilder, and a personal friend who I just appreciate so much. Damon, welcome to Grit Machine DNA.
Thanks for having me, David. It's great to be here. Great to be on your podcast.
Thank you, Damon. Well, you know what we do today. Damon, part of the discussion today is to truly shine a light on who you are. You have done some remarkable things despite some challenges like me. We share a lot in common. And I thought it was time to have a conversation with you and inspire people, especially young people who might be living similar circumstances that you and I were when we were adolescents in Ohio, Puerto Rico, on my end, Puerto Rico, and inland Mass. So want to get right to it. My first question, Damon, is who is Damon Patton?
Well, thank you, David. I am a child of Cleveland, Ohio, East Side Cleveland, Ohio. Very unassuming upbringing. Had a mother, had a father. Very basic. That's not to say that I had everything handed to me or anything, silver spoon or anything like that. I definitely had problems in my upbringing. And like a great many of African Americans, I didn't have both parents in the home. And that brought about its own difficulties and trials and things of that sort. But in addition to that, like you said, I'm an attorney. I left Cleveland and moved to Washington, D.C., where I've come to appreciate a great many things and notice how that if you put full effort into what you want to be, you can achieve. Also, and most important, I am a man who seeks God, seeks to please God, find my purpose with him, and make sure that I live in according to his word.
I appreciate that, Damon. I'm gonna poke a little bit about your early upbringing, because I think one of the topics that I want to cover with you as a person of Hispanic background is this whole topic of people of color it's hard for people of color to make it, the system's against them, etc. Let's tackle that right at the outset, because I think it's important to cover your early days as a young person, young adolescent, young man, and throughout, and then we'll get to sort of later on where you are today in your career and your life. What was it like growing up when you were young?
It was definitely I had it, what I would term myself, looking back, better than most. I had known other children, other friends who had definitely rougher instances than I had. I had grown up in a fairly middle class community. Went to fairly decent schools. The biggest, I guess, hamstring on ultimately that could have sidetracked my development was my family structure. My parents were never married. I lived with my mother. And to the degree that my mother and father had issues and would fight it out and things like that, that would ultimately impact me and how I saw both of them. Yep. Ultimately, both of them cared for me immensely, and both of them had a definite interest in making sure that I achieved. Yeah. And it was never an issue about whether I was going to college, it's where I was going. They often spoke into my lives, and my father particularly took me to church. There was no question. Anytime, I only went with him every other weekend. Wow. But on those weekends, I was in church. And if you know a Black church, they start at 11:15 and maybe you get out by 2. So you're there for a long time. And my father, he also instilled with me a work ethic. That being that I would go over to his house and I would work in the yard. That would not be something I would do at my mom's house.
Yeah.
He taught me a great many things, and he instilled just a center, a foundation, because I noticed that a lot of children coming up today without their fathers, they're just missing that. And it's more apparent the older I get, and as I identify with some of the things that I know from my father, as I reach the ages that he was when he instructed me, I can see how important those lessons were.
Yeah.
So.
Where do you think that for your father? It sounds like your father was incredible. I know he passed, but I remember our conversations about your dad, and it sounds like he was remarkably disciplined and focused. Where do you think that came from?
Well, one, he also had his father in the home. So, I mean, my grandfather, huge man, he had migrated my father's side of the family from Mississippi and brought them to Cleveland.
Wow.
And, when my father was a young boy, and he grew up with that discipline. And my father also was an Army man. And contrary to what a lot of people think today is racism, he was a Army man in a time where it was very different. He was openly called the N-word when he served, and people dared him to do anything about it.
Yeah.
But again, he also went to church as well. So he had the moral center as well. And he brought that to me. And I could see the discipline from both his faith and years of military service and his lifestyle. When I left my mom's house to go to my dad's house, it was a very different experience. His shoes were shine polished, kept in a room. Everything was very well kept. House immaculate, driveway, lawn, everything immaculate. And he had a code, and that's what he lived by. And he impressed that upon me. We would go back and forth, especially as I got older, but I can appreciate that now, that code that he lived by.
I have to ask, what was the code?
Well, I mean, it wasn't always something that he voiced. It was just his manner, his mannerisms, and how he would talk to me and how he would expect me to talk to him. There was no messing around. There are often stories about when I was probably a toddler, and for whatever reason, I was fine when we were at home. But when I went out, particularly to restaurants, I was all over the place, ducking under chairs, talking to other people at other tables, and generally just a mess. Well, my father never dealt with that. He straight to the bathroom, come back out a different person. But he his code more or less was you had to have faith and you had to carry yourself as a man.
Yeah.
There was no wishy-washy. You understood where he came from. And even if he was wrong, he was man enough to admit it, and man enough to own up to any mistakes that he had, man enough to just embrace who he was. Now, he would tell you he wasn't perfect, and sometimes he had a temper, but the code he lived by was something everybody knew where he stood, and I always respected that about him.
Yeah, I love that, Damon. You know, we have so much in common. In my book, I talk about, you know, the influence
Hmm.
that my father and my grandfather had in my life. It was very similar. My
Hmm.
grandfather and my father, both servicemen. My grandfather is passed. My father's still with me, but they were very similar.
Hmm.
You were out in society. There was a way to be as a young man. You
Yes.
spoke with respect. You treated everyone with respect, and you represented your family name. And if
Hmm.
you violated your family name, there was a consequence to be paid at home. So I can appreciate the perspective and the relationship you had with your father and what he represented. I love the phrase you used, know who you are. My
Hmm.
father used to say that a lot. You are not a follower, you are a leader. You don't do what other people do.
Hmm.
So I appreciate you sharing that with us.
Hmm.
It sounds to me, Damon, like your father was an instrumental figure in your life. What else shaped your life as you continued to get, you know, into adolescence, teenage years, high school,
Hmm.
college? What were the factors that were shaping you?
Um, as I grew up, I was a okay student and an okay church parishioner. If anything, I would be lukewarm. I had given my life to Christ. I had gone, everyone has the call to the altar,
Yeah.
and I had done it, but I was young, and I'm not exactly sure if I truly understood what that meant.
Mm.
So when all those things come together and you're growing up and you trying to understand your place in life and things like that, sometimes there are situation or events, like you say, that just kind of intervene and exactly put you on the path where you need to be. And for me, that was my undergrad school, college,
Mm.
um, Ashland University. Um, it was the only school I applied to. I wasn't very up to applying to colleges. I had only really found Ashland University because a friend of mine was talking about applying there,
Wow.
and it seemed to have the majors that I was interested in.
Yeah.
So I applied there. Um, like I say, I was just an okay student. I got in, and from the probably the first time I set foot on campus, I knew there was a change in the temperature. Um, for whatever reason, and I can only say this is God's will. Uh, I fell into friendships with godly people
Wow.
once I got there.
Mm.
Uh, People who I am still friends with today. And I could have easily gotten there because I'd known people, other students, other friends of mine who, when you get to college, you do the drinking thing,
Yep.
you fall in with uh, just a lifestyle and your grades suffer, you fall out or what have you. But falling in with these young men who were all older
Wow.
just set me on the right path. I grew in my faith. I joined Fellowship of Christian Athletes. I went on various mission trips. Um, we had gotten into Bible studies,
Mm.
and it really shaped and molded me on a path to ultimately where I ended up today. And without that, I honestly I don't know where I would be. It's just purely the intervention of godly people
Yeah.
in my life at that school that helped
Wow.
me out.
I love the, I love what I'm hearing. It's early on. You know, you had a wonderful family, in particular, dad and grandpa. It sounds like serving as male role models and instilling in you some essential traits and values like responsibility, self-reliance, personal agency. But then this sort of, in addition to that, faith,
Mm-hmm.
to help establish a moral foundation that, in my view, becomes so powerful and so important to help people get through circumstances and to have a light, a clear light and target for your future and your salvation. That's wonderful, man. So typically you don't hear about these stories about faith and college, etc. Why? I want to ask you, why do you think that is? In other words, we typically hear about college as sort of like the future of your career, or where you're going to earn your keep when you get older, et cetera, get a job because you went to college. Why don't we hear about the faith side? In particular for us, Judeo-Christian values, typically at colleges and universities.
I believe there was a shift somewhere, far in advance of actually me going to school, but it was in the air, if you will, even then. Wow. The idea that kind of pushed away more of the Judeo-Christian beliefs and brought more about modern thinking, and modern thinking being a break with tradition, if you will, traditional roles, traditional ideals, and that started to manifest itself within the colleges, because at the college level, it was very different from high school and elementary school, if you will, and middle school. Children were away from their parents, away from their foundation, in a new place, meeting different people. They were easily influenced. So when they get there, it's all about the experience. Try something different. And I see that only has progressed up until today, when you go on a college campus and it is very different from what I remember. There are various ideologies, and it's almost as if you can't be Christian on a college campus, or it's very somewhat shunned because your ideas are more traditional, and they clash with those ideas of today.
Yeah, it's interesting observation. I mean, my own experience. I was blessed to have extremely faith-based family. But when I got to college, there were several students who used to invite me to Bible study groups. I went a couple of times. What's interesting, by the way, is that they were Asian students. They were wonderful people. But to your point, it wasn't the thing to do. And even though I had these deeply ingrained biblical values, I didn't talk about it. And those guys used to pray for me. To this day, I'm still in touch with two of the three. And they were like prayer warriors during my college career. But it wasn't something that I talked about because it just wasn't accepted, and it wasn't like the thing to do. So I appreciate you sharing that. It's an interesting perspective. I hadn't thought about that. So Damon, let me pivot a little bit. What got you into the path of being a lawyer?
Well, like I said, when I went to school, I finished school, and unfortunately, like many students today, I had picked a major that really didn't manifest itself into a job.
We're gonna talk about that. Go ahead.
Right, exactly. So I thought that it just wasn't enough. It wasn't specific enough. It wasn't skilled enough. It was like a jack of all trades major, but a master of nothing. So I got in my mind, I thought, I would go to grad school, double down on my major was criminal justice, double down on criminal justice, get a master's, and surely enough, that would bridge the chasm. Alas, it did not. So I spent a little time. outside of that, and just on a side note, this is the time where after I left grad school, I went to live with my father full time.
Wow.
And I developed a great relationship with him through the time he passed. And I wouldn't miss that time for the world. But it was there that I was working. I was working at loss prevention jobs, and I had a crisis of conscience at that time. And it was a crossroads for me.
Wow.
I was, I believe I was 26 or 27, and I was not making enough money between my loss prevention jobs. And I had a car that I had to pay for. I had student loans I had to pay for. And I just really wasn't making ends meet. And my biggest fear at the time was I was staying in my father's house, and I had a place in the basement where all my things were, computer and things of that sort.
Yep.
I did not want to be 30 years old and at my dad's house with my stuff in the basement. It would eat me up at night. And finally, I had a good friend of mine who I'm still pretty good friends with today mentioned going to law school. Wow. And I'm like, oh man, I don't know. That's a long time, a lot of work. And he said, you can do it. I know it. I have faith in you. You could do it. And when I took the LSAT and didn't get the score I really wanted, he said, no, you're going to do this. You can do this. I know you can do this. Wow. And, I went ahead and applied. I got in. And that first year was like nothing I'd ever experienced. It was so much harder than grad school. And it was another pivotal point in my life because it required me to actually take the reins of something and exercise some discipline over my life and compartmentalize how I was going to do things and not let things just happen. So, but the law school part of my life, that gave me a course, a path in which that I was going to change my trajectory from being someone who potentially had no path to having a path forward and being able to care for myself and take care of myself into the future.
Wow. I mean, there's so many lessons in this last few minutes, Damon. I want to poke at all of them. The first one is, here is this young adult who did not have the understanding that the degree he was pursuing, frankly, had a specific skill that was going to inure income or value later on in life, right? It's a very specific niche. Number one, we'll talk about that in a minute. Number two, you had somebody supporting you to say, hey, look, how about this? Support and networks and people around you, that I like to say that God puts around you to inspire you and to help you achieve bigger. That was huge. The third piece is your educational path. Here we go from college to grad school to law school. And so, the amount of financial investments I assume you were making were monumental, but the return on the investment, right? Somebody has to help some folks think through that. And that's another piece that I want to touch a little bit on. Let me start with this one. Number one, how do we change this dialogue that, I'm going to say, pushes people to say, get a degree, but does not help? It happened to me, sociology, right? Wonderful. I had a wonderful experience in college. I mean, I was literally training myself how to think. And as you know, we'll get into this later, but your partner, Hurley Roseman, was literally like a mentor to me. And she helped me think critically. Most folks aren't taught how to think about their future. What skills are you gaining
Mm-hmm.
to help you gain income or to create value or to start a company, et cetera, in the future. Why is that?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think we have to start changing the conversation.
Hmm.
Uh, and it starts earlier. We have to educate people that the more information that they have when making a decision will ultimately impact the decisions that they make.
Yeah.
Too many people are willing to just hear the rhetoric or hear whatever people are telling them and just say, okay, that's it. I'm going to just do that because X said so. When they have really no fundamental understanding of why that's the path they should take, or if it's the path they should take. It could even be correct, but you have no fundamental understanding of why that's correct.
Yeah.
And that's where a degree that works.
Hey, Damon, sorry, we lost you for like the last 5 seconds, what you
Okay.
said, and that's where.
Oh, okay. And that's where we need to have a discussion early on to educate people about the decisions that they're making in life and to have more of a part to do with how those decisions are made.
Yeah.
It's like you said with the degrees. The prevalent thinking is you go to school, you go to high school, you go to college, and then you get a job.
Yep.
Well, that's not everybody's path. It's not always going to be everybody's path. And if you do go to college, what are you going to college for? What is the outcome you want to achieve? Because there are plenty of people going to college that aren't achieving the outcomes that they desire.
Yeah.
But people continue to go to college and it just keeps happening. Yep. So we need to focus on the outcomes first and then cater the plan to reach those outcomes. And that includes college. That includes planning in college, making sure that you get the right major, making sure that if college is for you, make sure that you do everything necessary to meet that goal in the end.
Yeah, totally
it's
agree.
Just about more education.
Yeah, I also love how you said we got to start earlier. So I honestly believe this starts at the home, right? When you have a well-functioning family, a father or mother who are teaching you how to think, helping you to understand that you need to create value, whether it's having the right skill sets or starting a company, you've got to create value here in America. It starts really early. And then frankly, the second part is as early as middle school and high school, start focusing on what are the technical skills you need: math, science, English, engineering, prepare you for a future, as opposed to your point, feel good about an education. Well, that's just the beginning. You have to focus on the outcome. I love that. The second thing I want to ask you or talk about is, it sounds like you had some wonderful people around you who were helping you think about your situation and what some options were for you. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, it's only through God's grace that I've had so many people to just kind of guide me along my path, from, of course, my parents, of course, my friends at my undergrad university. Of course, it's interesting. The friend that told me that I should go to law school, he actually was my resident advisor at Youngstown State, my graduate school. Wow. And that's how we gained a friendship, and that's how that came about.
Wow.
But yeah, and I had just so many people that were there to assist me, and you could never quite know going into that how these things will work out. But God has a purpose for all of us. Yeah. And he has plans for us. And it's just so long as we go along with those plans, that purpose,
Yeah.
he'll guide us in the direction that he wants us to go. And sometimes I'm a planner. I like to stay disciplined, but sometimes I think to myself, there's no way that I could have planned how the outcome necessarily came out when I entered versus what God has done. It's just so much grander. So when I went, for example, when I went to law school, I had no idea that I would end up in Washington, D.C. Just none. That's not even on my radar. And it was the people that God placed in my path that set me up to be where I am today.
Yep. Hey.
And I could have done without them.
Yeah, no question. Jeremiah 29:11. For I know the plans I have for you. No question.
I read that this morning.
Right, there you go. But what's so there's three parts to that, right? There is Damon had a wonderful foundation and faith and belief in Jesus Christ, right? Number one, that is such a strong moral compass to help enable you right toward the right path. The second piece, though, there were people around you who were supportive and who were thinking about your improvement, right, in life, and that's crucial. The point is, we have to surround ourselves with people who truly care about us, and who truly are grounded in the right values. That's the second part. Then the second part that I hear is you want it better. You want it better. And so, it's funny, when I was in college, I was totally ghetto in high school. I get to college and my first experience was my bunch of different explosions in my brain. But one of them is, look, I stopped glorifying ghetto culture. I said, well, time out. I want better for myself. And that's the third piece I hear with you. It's, look, I want it better. This was not the right place for me. The basement of my father's home, I want it better. So those three things are so important to highlight in your story, Damon. So let me pivot a little bit. I want to talk a little bit about your career and then your hobby, what I call your hobby. Bodybuilding. So let's first talk about the career. I hear these discussions a lot. So Massachusetts, you're in Washington, D.C. I hear these discussions often. I was just at my old alma mater last week, Lynn Classical High School, talking to the principal. I just joined the board of Cristo Rey High School in Boston, a wonderful mission, work study, real work for high school kids starting in sophomore year, which I strongly support. But part of the discussions that I was hearing was this whole notion that there's not a lot of opportunity for Black kids and Latino kids. And, I had to push back on one of them saying, well, I disagree. There's opportunity everywhere in America. The question is, A, do we want better for ourselves? B, do they see it? Do they understand that there's opportunity here? And 3, do they have people around them that are supporting them in that direction as opposed to telling them they can't do something? So I want to talk about that. I mean, you became a lawyer, you're successful, you live in a wonderful area of Washington, D.C. Were there obstacles along the way that prevented you from getting a law degree or from getting a job? Were there people or circumstances, racism, discrimination, anything that stopped you?
Now, it's a very great question, because part of the reason why I'm in DC is because things weren't easy. And now, I guess to continue the story in through law school, I was an okay law student. I tried really hard. I mean, I focused. Some things come to some people much faster. And to me, sometimes it took me rehashing it over and over and over again. And, I had my favorite subjects, criminal law, some contracts, things of that sort, secure transaction. I love those things. But then other ones were just very difficult for me. So I had seen people drop out at law school who, for whatever reasons, decided that it wasn't for them, friends of mine. And that was always something that kind of sat with me. Would I quit? Would this become too difficult for me?
Wow.
It requires a lot of time, a lot of effort. You're going to miss events. You're going to miss events with family. You're going to miss going out with your friends. You're going to miss a whole lot of things. And am I willing to make that sacrifice in order to make sure that I attain this goal? And ultimately, it just makes you sit there and actually take just focus on what you're trying to do. But when I did finish law school, I wasn't one of those students who immediately passed the bar either. so I mean, it's something when, you take the bar exam, you go in there, it's as difficult as you thought it was. And you don't pass. Yeah. I mean, you get a lot of, I don't know that there's a lot of discussion about people who don't initially pass it. And in the Black community, the rate of passage is much lower than it is overall. And unfortunately, I fell into that. Yeah. And you see some of your friends, they passed and they know you didn't pass. So that's also the hard part, and you lose opportunities because you might have had things lined up in anticipation of you passing, right, and those things kind of fall through. So it's very difficult. And what that led me to do is, because I had opportunities that started to dry up in Cleveland, I decided to move to Washington, D.C., uproot myself from my family, and take a chance on making a new start in a completely new city that maybe I'd been to once or twice before.
Yeah. What drove that, Damon? I mean, what propelled you to say, I'm leaving?
It was an inner desire not to be, I didn't want to fail. I didn't want to go through all this work and fail. Yeah. It just wasn't an option for me. Yeah. And I didn't want to sit there and go back to a job after law school that was not something that I had gone to school for. Yeah. And just take the easy way out. So I went down to visit a couple weeks in advance, check out the layout and everything, see how everything was, and then I picked up and moved. Wow. I eventually passed the bar in DC, but it just, thinking back on it now, it was a difficult time.
Yeah. Damon, I'm going to press a little bit here. I've never had an easy time with tests. Never. Didn't do great. The sheer force of my work ethic, frankly, of course, faith, family, et cetera, has propelled me through my life to where I am today. I'm a worker, right? And if I see you beat me, I'm going to figure out how to beat you. I just have this competitive hunger drive in my DNA. There's this discussion around, look, we got to change testing because it's discriminatory against kids of color, you and I. I get it. I reject it. I fight against it because I put myself in a place where I say, if you can do it, I can do it. Can you talk about that a little bit? I mean, look, testing, not easy. Law degree, definitely not easy to attain. Against the backdrop of tenacity, hunger, and drive. What matters most? How a test is structured, whether it's set up against you, or whether you have fundamental beliefs and values to propel you to your goal?
I believe that regardless of how you feel about the tests or what they look like or what they involve or what have you, you're always going to need standards. You're always going to need standards by which you can judge others or judge yourself.
Yeah.
Because if that's the only way you progress, that's the only way you find out where you fail and where you can do better. If there's nothing ever to hold you to any standard, then you're in the breeze and you're susceptible to anything that comes along. And I find that the idea that to remove testing only for people of color, frankly, I find it insulting. It's almost as if to say that we are incapable of rising to the bar and surpassing it. And I think that's just, I think that handicaps us.
Yeah.
And we need, in post-slavery time, the Black family was married at a probably 80-90% clip and accomplished a great many things. Had Black Wall Street, had their own shops and stores, maintained their own households, had done a great many things. But then now you come to some 70, 80 years later, and everything is almost seems to be worse now. And it's because we've stepped away from those traditions, those standards that we once held high. Yeah. It used to be that, particularly for my grandfather, and it's why they partially why he moved him from Mississippi to Cleveland, because he wanted better opportunities for his children. He wanted them to get a good education. He wanted them to succeed. That was the mindset. Yeah. Nowadays, it seems like we can only succeed if things are made easier for us, or the bar is lowered, or you give the opportunity to me and I don't have to work for it. Yeah. It's just not something that I can agree with either.
Yeah, look, I'm going to jump in on that, Damon. I grew up I was blessed to have my grandfather around us so much. We used to go to our grandparents' home every Sunday. That was it's typically the Hispanic way. It's what we did. We still do it with my parents. And my grandfather and my grandmother represented everything that we wanted to be. He earned his way. Here's a guy with a 6th grade education, agrarian lifestyle early on, goes to the war, World War II, and comes to the United States against all odds, was in a segregated regiment, the 65th Infantry, one of the last segregated regiments in the United States for Puerto Ricans, treated like dog crap, but he persevered. And against all odds, everything he instilled in us as young children, I'll be here for hours, but it was all about self-respect, self-determination, and doing better for yourself. Everything. He used to dress beautiful, immaculate. He had his Cadillac that he earned. He had a beautiful wife that he was really proud of, my grandmother. And that's all he did. He would show up to our house whenever he'd come over to check in on my father or us, because my father was typically working to the direct. How are you guys doing? But man, the self-respect this guy had, he was 5'6", always dressed to the nines, always. And so to your point, you have to have standards. I love that point. And my grandfather made it clear, this is who we are, and this is who you're going to be. Set yourself a huge bar and go get it. My father did the same thing. My father, even though he struggled, my father made it very clear, you're not going to be like them. You don't glorify ghetto. You do this. This is who you are. And so I love the conversation about standards, because I also feel that today we have dropped standards. We literally either teach to the average, and this is the conversation I was having with the principal, my old alma mater. It's almost like we're teaching to the average, telling the students it's okay to be a failure. And I reject that. I think we have to push the bar even higher and say, no. This is what you want to be. And guess what?
Mm-hmm.
If somebody who is wealthy and white racially did better than you after their family was here 4 generations, well, that's wonderful. Why don't you aim for that? Instead of saying, oh, I can't do that. Well, of course you can. It may take your children to do it because you set them up, but aspire to do that. That's wonderful. That's a goal. So I love your perspective on standards. Damon, so let's talk a little bit about bodybuilding. What I call your hobby. I mean, no, look, in all seriousness, man, look, you've done great. You're my kids say Damon's jacked. My kids say, you know, Anthony Azana, he's more buff than you, Dad. And I say, hey, absolutely. But what has that meant for you as you go through that journey and as part of your life, as part of who you are as a person? What has that meant for you, and what lessons can we take away from that?
It's interesting. For a good portion of my life, when I was younger, into my almost late 20s, I was very heavy. I think at my heaviest, I was 285 pounds. And I had always known it was an issue, in part because I knew in my family history, there were instances of hypertension, high blood pressure, and I would later find out diabetes. And those things were waiting for me if I didn't do anything different. Yeah. At one point, I started thinking, I said, you know what, I'm just going to have to change things. I would come home from school and I would go to the gym and get a gym pass for 3 months while I was between school years. And when I finally graduated, I said, you know what, I'm going to sign up for a gym membership. And this was a big deal for me because you had to put money down and you had to pay every month, whether you win or not, because you were in a contract. I said, oh, man, well, this is real now. I mean, I don't have enough money really as it is, and have someone taking money for something and not do anything about it, well, that just can't go. So I decided to go to the gym, and I started to lose weight, and I started to get in better shape. And it was something, it was one of those unspoken things that my father taught me, because unfortunately, he had not managed his high blood pressure as well as probably he should have over a great many years. All those years I was coming up. And unfortunately, that's ultimately what cost him his life. What that said to me is, I have to chart my own course. I have to be responsible for the things that I eat. I have to be responsible for what I do with my body. I have to, with this information, again, we go back to information. Information gives you the opportunity to make good choices. So the more information you have, the better your ability to be successful. So I had this information. I said, you know what, I'm going to take it and run with it. Now, the bodybuilding was something that I just wanted to try. And it had been that way for a couple of years. And again, a support system, like you said, it almost seemed like serendipity. I said, I want to do this. And don't you know, within a month, a trainer at my gym who specialized in bodybuilding competitions started working there. Wow. And we linked up, and I did a couple of shows, and I haven't done any since the pandemic, but I guess bodybuilding is just like any other practice or skill. You get better at it the more you do of it. Kind of like a martial art. At the beginning, you can't do much of anything, but as the years pass, you become skilled and you can do a great many things. This is the same way. It teaches you about your own mental framework and your ability to accomplish things that you set yourself out to do, even when they seem impossible. So And that's why I love it. You succeed and fail all the time. You work until you fail, and then you work to surpass your failure. So that's
yeah. But look, Damon, there's so many wonderful lessons in what you just said, right?
Mhm.
There is the support system, there is discipline, there is responsibility, and I love what you just said. There is success and failure. You have to be comfortable. There's also progression, right? Things take time. And so within those last two categories, you have to be comfortable failing, which means you have to be comfortable taking risks. The second part is the progression. You know, people are talking to me all the time. And as you know, we Samantha and I and a few other folks launched Aura Inc., financial coaching, financial wealth. You do that well too. But the point is, you know, everybody around here is talking to us about, oh, you know, we have to, how do we help people close the income gap? And my response is, well, time out. Let's understand where they are in their financial life cycle, right? Because it could mean that they just came to the United States and they're going to have to take a journey toward better wealth planning and better budgeting over time. But it doesn't mean that we need to make them wealthy now. They have to earn that. And so
giving them the money right now doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to change anything.
Right. But I appreciate your respect because bodybuilding has those exemplary fundamentals, right? You have to work hard at something. You have to get better at it, but you're going to have to take time to get better over time. And I love that as an example of what you do. Damon, let me get into a little bit of another a related topic that I want people to definitely get your perspective on, and it's a subject of leadership. We as people in America toss that word around all the time. Leader, leader, leader. What is leadership to you?
It's interesting. I'm in a class right now with my church, and it's just talking about lessons, leadership lessons in Jesus. And I guess if I had to think of a definition for leadership, it would be, I guess, the ability to guide or cultivate others to a given purpose or goal. And within that, a leader is going to exhibit discipline. They're going to be able to motivate. They're going to have a passion about what they're working towards, and they're going to speak with authority. If a leader can do all those things, I think they can manifest into exhibiting good leadership.
Yeah, I love that answer. All right, let me do a parallel question. What is grit?
Well, I think of grit. When I think of grit, I think of the innate deep down ability to be able to overcome. And it manifests itself in many different areas. It could be grit, meaning that dirt under your fingernails to show that, you know, that you've actually had the battles or the scars and things like that. But it also could be, you know, you've made it to or attained a position where no one thought you could attain. You've come out the other side of the hard part. So grit is internal.
Yeah, totally agree, man. I'm gonna get to the closer. A question I've been meaning to ask you for a long time, Damon. Knowing your upbringing, your background, knowing where you are today, if Damon were to go back home to one of the great schools back home, what would Damon say to the 10, 11, 12-year-olds that are sitting in classrooms today, in the context of today's culture, et cetera, what would be Damon's message to them?
I would say, first off, I would say, realize and keep your faith in God, because there's going to be many a tribulation and problem. Just overall, there's going to be tough parts in your life, and you need a foundation from which to stand on. There's so many people that they just don't have that foundation, and they sway in different ways. You see it in the media and social media, and they just don't have that foundation from which to stand. And it creates this, they almost don't know why they're living or what they're here for, or they do things that just don't seem to make sense. Yeah. Another thing I would say is, and I've alluded to this a couple of times, information is key. Always educate yourself. Know what you're doing. Understand why you're doing it. Because people won't always tell you things. And sometimes they'll effectively keep it from you, because it's that information that allows people to become more than what they are. And sometimes I think with the testing we were talking about, it's as if they think they're doing us a favor by keeping it from us. But yeah, it would be those two things: your faith and to educate yourself. And those would be the two strongest things I would say to it.
I love that.
A middle schooler.
I love that. I would just add one third, man. I would talk about personal responsibility.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, personal responsibility. I frankly, I was blessed like you to have an incredible father and parents and a football coach. That's all they drilled into me: personal responsibility. You're accountable for this, and you have to do this. I love your message. Extreme focus on faith, Judeo-Christian values for us. Number two, information. I marry that with critical thinking, right? You have to be able to analyze information and say, well, time out. What are all the variables that I'm hearing here? And my favorite, not that it's more important, but personal responsibility. So thanks, Damon. Anything else you want to share before we close, Damon?
Yeah, I really appreciate you having me on. This has been great. I as always, you're a great host. And I wish you much success, sir.
Thank you, Damon. Well, this is not the last time we'll be talking, but I want to thank everybody for joining us today on Grit Machine DNA. To learn more about what we're doing, my book, the Grit Machine podcast, check out my website, davidamorales.com. And I hope to see you soon at our next conversation. Thanks, everybody.
Si vives día a día en un abismo de dolor y buscas solución a tus problemas, busca del Señor y sigue su camino, y pronto nacerá la paz en tu corazón. Y con la paz del Señor yo he vencido mi temor, y yo vivo victorioso por su amor. Y con la paz del Señor yo he vencido mi temor, y yo vivo victorioso por su amor. Si vives día a día en un abismo de dolor y buscas solución a tus problemas, busca del Señor y sigue su